Hey everyone, we've got Mark Twain. Couldn't see that, the sun's kind of weird. It's right in my eyes. But we have Mark Twain's The Celebrated Jumping Frog. It's a quick, short story, but it's very fun. Let's go ahead here. Let me get to it real quick and get into it. In compliance with the request of a friend of mine who wrote me from the East, I called on good-natured, glorious old Simon Wheeler and inquired after my friend's friend, Leonidas W. Smiley, has requested to do, and hereunto append the result. I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that if I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of his infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and bore me to death with some exasperating reminiscence of him as long and as tedious as it should be useless to me. If that was the design, it succeeded. I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably by the barroom stove of the dilapidated tavern in the decayed mining camp of Angels, and I noticed that he was fat and bald-headed, and had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance. He roused up and gave me good day. I told him that a friend of mine had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood named Leonidas W. Smiley. Rev. Leonidas W. Smiley, a young minister of the gospel, who had heard was one time a resident of Angel's Camp. I added that if Mr. Wheely could tell me anything about this Rev. Leonidas W. Smiley, I would feel under my obligations to him. Simon Wheeler backed me into a corner and blockaded me there with his chair, and then sat down and reeled off the monstrous narrative which follows this paragraph. He never smiled. He never frowned. He never changed his voice from the gentle, flowing key to which he tuned his initial sentence. He never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm, but all through the interminable narrative there ran a vein of impressive earnestness and sincerity, which showed me plainly that, so far from his imagining that there was anything ridiculous or funny about his story, he regarded it as a really important matter, and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent genius in finesse. I let him go on his own way, and never interrupted him once. Rev. Leonidas W. Reverend Well, there was a feller here once by the name of Jim Smiley in the winter of '49, or maybe it was the spring of '50. I don't recollect exactly. Somehow, though, what makes me think it was one or the other is because I remembered the big flame wasn't finished when he first come to the camp. But anyway, he was the curious man about always betting on anything that turned up you ever see. If he could get anybody to bet on the other side, and if he couldn't, he'd change sides. Anyway, that suited the other men would suit him. Anyway, just so he's got a bet. He was satisfied. But still, he was lucky. Uncommon lucky. He most always came out winner. He was always ready and laying for a chance. There couldn't be no solitary thing mentioned that the feller'd offer to bet on it, and take a wry side you please. As I was just telling you, if there was a horse race, you'd find him flush or you'd find him busted at the end of it. If there was a dog fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a cat fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a chicken fight, he'd bet on it. Why, if there was two birds settin' on a fence, he would bet you which one would fly first. Or, if there was a camp meeting, he would be there regular to bet on Parson Walker, which he judged to be the best extorter about here. And so he was too, and a good man, if he ever seen a straddlebug start to go anywheres. He would bet you how long it would take him to get to wherever he was going. And if you took him up, he would follow that straddlebug to Mexico. But what he would find out where he was bound for and how long he was on the road. Lots of the boys here has seen that Smiley and can tell you about him. Why, it's never made no difference to him. He'd bet on anything. The dangdest feller. Parson Walker's wife laid very sick once for a good while, and it seems as if there weren't going to save her. But one morning he came in, and Smiley up and asked him how she was. And he said she was considerably better. Thank the Lord for his infinite mercy. And come on so smart that with the blessing of Providence, she'd get well yet. And Smiley, before thought says, well, I'll risk 2.5. She don't, anyway. Thurshire Smiley had a mare. The boys called her the 15-minute nag. But that was only in fun, you know, because of course she was faster than that. And he used to win money on that horse, for all she was so slow and always had the asthma, or the distemper, or the consumption, or something of that kind. They used to give her 200 or 300 yards start, and then pass her underway. But always, at the fag end of the race, she'd get excited and desperate-like, and come cavorting and straddling up, and scattered her legs around limber, sometimes in the air, and sometimes out to one side among the fences, and kicking up more dust, and raising more racket, with her coughing and sneezing and blowing her nose, and always fetch up at the stand just about a neck ahead, as near as you could cipher it down. And he had a little small bullpup that, to look at him, you'd think he weren't nothing, a cent, but to set around and look ornery and lay for a chance to steal something. But as soon as money was up on him, he was a different dog. He'd underjawed begin to stick out, like the forecastle of a steamboat, and his teeth would uncover and shine like the furnaces, and a dog might tackle him and brag him, and bite him, or throw him over his shoulder 2 or 3 times. And Andrew Jackson, which was the name of the pup, Andrew Jackson would never let on. But what? He was satisfied, and hadn't expected nothing else. And the bets being doubled and doubled on the other side all the time, till the money was all up. And then all of a sudden, he would grab that other dog just by the jint of his hind leg and freeze it, too. Not chaw, you understand, but only just grip and hang on till they'd throwed up the sponge, if it was a year. Smiley always came out a winner on that pup, till he harnessed the dog once that didn't have no hind legs, because they'd been sawed off in a circular saw. And when the thing had gone along so far, and the money was all up, he came to make a snatch for his pet Holt. He see in a minute how he'd been imposed on, and how the other dog had him in the door, so to speak. And he peered surprised, and then he looked sorter discouraged like, and didn't try no more to win the fight, and so he got shucked out bad. He gave Smiley a look, as much as to say his heart was broke, and it was his fault, for putting up a dog that hadn't no hind legs for him to take holt of. which was his main dependence in a fight. And then he limped off a piece and laid down and died. He was a good pup, was that Andrew Jackson, and would have made a name for himself if he'd lived. For the stuff was in him, and he'd had genius. I know it, because he hadn't no opportunities to speak of. And it don't stand to reason that a dog could make such a fight as he could under them circumstances if he'd hadn't no talent. It always makes him feel sorry when I think of the last fight of his'n and the way it turned out. Well, tish year, Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and tomcats and all them kind of things till you couldn't rest, and you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on, but he'd match you. He catched a frog one day and took him home, and said he collated to educate him. And so he never done nothing for 3 months but sat in his backyard and learned that frog to jump. And you bet he did learn him too. He'd give him a little punch behind, and the next minute you'd see that jog whirling in the air like a donut. See him turn one somerset, or maybe a couple, if he got a good start, and come down flat-footed and all right, like a cat. He got him up so in the matter of catching flies and keeping him in practice so constant that he'd nail a fly every time as fur as he could see him. Smiley said all a frog wanted was education, and he could do most anything. And I believe him. Why, I'd seen him set Daniel Webster down here on this floor, and Daniel Webster was the name of the frog, and sing out, "Flies, Daniel, flies!" And quicker than you could wink, he'd spring straight up and snake a fly off in the counter there, and flop down on the floor again as solid as a gob of mud, and fall that scratching the side of his head with his hind foot as indifferent as if he hadn't no idea he'd been doing anything more than any frog might do. You never seen a frog so modest and straightforward as he was. For all he was so gifted. And when it came to fair and square jumping in the dead level, he could get over more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed you ever see. Jumping on a dead level was his strong suit, you understand. And when it come to that, Smiley would ain't up money on him as long as he had a red. Smiley was monstrous proud of his frog, and well he might be, for fellers that had traveled and been anywheres all said he'd laid over any frog that ever they see. Well, Smiley keeped the beast in a little lattice box, and he used for fetch him down sometimes and lay for a bet. One day a feller, a stranger in the camp he was, came across him with his box, and says, "What might it be you've got in that box?" And Smiley says, sorta indifferent like, "It might be a parrot, or it might be a canary. Maybe, but it ain't. It's only just a frog." And the feller took it, and looked at it careful, and turned it round this way and that, and says to him, "So 'tis. Well, what's he good for?" "Well," Smiley says, easy and careless, "he's good enough for one thing, I should judge. He can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." The feller took the box again, and took another long, particular look, and gave it back to Smiley and says, very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I don't see no pints about that frog that's any better than any other frog." "Maybe you don't," Smiley says. "Maybe you understand frogs, and maybe you don't understand them. Maybe you've had experience, and maybe you ain't only an amateur, as it were. Anyways, I've got my opinion, and I'll resk $40 that he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." And the feller studied a minute, and then says, kinder sad-like, "Well, I'm only a stranger here, and I ain't got no frog. But if I had a frog, I'd bet you." And then Smiley says, That's all right, that's all right. If you'll hold my box a minute, I'll go and get you a frog. And so the feller took the box and put up his $40 along with Smiley's and sat down to wait. So he sat there a good while thinking and thinking to himself. And then he got the frog out and prized his mouth open and took a teaspoon and filled it full of quail shot. Filled him pretty near up to his chin and set him on the floor. Smiley, he went to the swamp and slopped round in the mud for a long time. And finally he catched a frog and fetched him in and give him to this feller and says, "Now, if you're ready, set him alongside of Daniel with his 4 paws just even with Daniel's, and I'll give the word." Then he says, 1, 2, 3, get! And him and the feller touched the frogs from behind, and this new frog hopped off lively, but Daniel didn't give a heave, and hoisted up his shoulders, so like a Frenchman. But it weren't no use. He couldn't budge. He was planted as solid as a church, and couldn't no more stir than if he was anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised, and he was disgusted too. But he hadn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. The feller took the money and started away. And when he was going out the door, he sort of jerked his thumb over his shoulder. So at Daniel and says very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I don't see no pints about that frog that's any better than any other frog." Smiley, he stood scratching his head and looking down at Daniel a long time. And at last he says, "I do wonder what in the nation that frog throwed off for. I wonder if there ain't something the matter with him. He 'pears to look mighty baggy somehow." And he catched Daniel by the nape of the neck and hefted him and says, "Why, blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pound." And turned him upside down, and he belched out a dabble handful of shot. And then he see how it was, and he was the maddest man. He set the frog down and took out after the fella, but he never catched him. And turning to me as he moved away, he said, "Just set here, ye are, stranger, and rest easy. I ain't going to be a second." But by your leave, I did not think that a continuation of the history of the enterprise vagabond Jim Smiley would be likely to afford me much information concerning the Reverend Leonidas W. Smile. So I started away. At the door, I met a sociable wheeler returning, and he buttonholed me and recommenced, "Well, this year Smiley had a yaller, one-eyed cow that didn't have no tail, only just a short stump like a banner, and, however, lacking both time and inclination. I did not wait to hear how the afflicted cow, but took my leave." So apparently that's how Smiley got bested when he was going after or betting his jumping frog. Hopefully you guys liked that, and we've got quite a few other Mark Twain stories here, short stories like that. You all have a wonderful and blessed day.